In 1896, Charles M. Sheldon, a Congregationalist minister, cast his vision of what the world could look like under the banner of Jesus by writing a book that he entitled In His Steps. Here's an old copy of it. Has anybody read it? In His Steps. All right, very good. He took the title from 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21, where Peter wrote, "For you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps." Now, the book chronicles the joy and the conflict that occurred when members of the First Church of Raymond pledged for an entire year to ask the question, what would Jesus do if he was in my place? The book became a spiritual classic. As of this month, in December of 2023, it has sold over 50 million copies. Almost 100 years later, in 1989, the youth group at Calvary Reformed Church in Holland, Michigan, studied Sheldon's book, and they decided to take the pledge also by asking the question before making any decision, what would Jesus do? To help them to remember to ask the question, they made colorful woven wristbands with the acronym WWJD. And the rest is history. It ignited a movement that found its way into books, onto t-shirts, jewelry, bumper stickers, and thousands of other items. Now, brethren, as faddish as it may seem, creating reminders is biblical. When we put scriptures on plaques, pictures, wear lapel pins, wear wristbands, we're honoring the spirit of Deuteronomy chapter 6, where Moses instructed the children of Israel to tie the scriptures on their hands, to put them on bands across their foreheads, to write them on the doorposts of their house and on their gates. Unfortunately, the phrase, "What would Jesus do?" has become a punchline, a parody, a laugh line that's been written into movie dialogues and scripts and Saturday Night Live skits. Recently, it's not been that fairly long ago, but I heard Shia LaBeouf use it in the first Transformers movie. He actually says, when the teacher was going to give him anything besides an A, he looked at him and he says, "What would Jesus do?" And of course, that has resulted in people shying away from using it. Others have suggested that instead of asking, "What would Jesus do?" we should ask, "What did Jesus do?" Which is okay, as long as after we've asked, "What did Jesus do?" we commit ourselves to doing what Jesus did and what he tells us to do. "If you love me," Jesus says, "you will keep my commandments." John 14, verse 15. "He who has my commandments and keeps them is the one who loves me." John 14, 21. Now we see that fleshed out in Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 to 13, where the Apostle Paul says, "So then, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who is at work in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure." So let me pull over here and park for a minute, because I want to comment on the sentence, "Work out your salvation with fear and trembling." Brethren, Why didn't the Apostle Paul say, work out your salvation with love and gratitude? Because that is the predominant message we hear today. In fact, it is rare to hear fear and trembling used as a motivation for working out our salvation. And yet, right there it is in the text. And not just a fear that is a watered down respect, but a fear that is qualified by trembling. The same fear and trembling that's used by the Hebrew writer described Moses when he comes face to face with God on Mount Sinai, Hebrews chapter 12, verse 21. The Apostle Paul wanted the believers at Philippi to take the responsibility of working out the righteousness that God had worked in them with a trembling earnestness. Because in the very next verse, verse 14, the Apostle Paul gives them and us an example of what that salvation looks like as it is worked out in our lives. Now, by the way, after 40-some years of preaching, this verse and this command has become one of my all-time favorite verses for the church. Are you ready for it? Here it comes. Do all things without grumbling or disputing. Or as the NIV translates it, do everything without complaining or arguing. I'm just going to let that sink in. Do you remember what happened to the children of Israel when they grumbled before God? When they murmured? One such example is found in Numbers chapter 16. And it's the same incident that the Apostle Paul references in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 10, to warn the Corinthian believers of the danger of grumbling and murmuring and complaining. In Numbers chapter 16, verse 49, it says that 14,700 Israelites died by a plague because they murmured against Moses and Aaron after 250 of their brothers and sisters were consumed by fire on account of them supporting the rebellion of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, who, by the way, were swallowed up by the earth. Does God take grumbling and murmuring serious? Now here's the thing. That was recorded in Numbers chapter 16, all of that and so many others. It was recorded, the Apostle Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 that these things happened to them as examples to us. 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, what happened to them was written down in order for us to learn from it. Severe consequences are attached to God's people murmuring. The Apostle Paul here was addressing a behavior that the Philippians would have been tempted to bring into their new life in Christ as a believer, which would have been the behavior of grumbling and complaining. Now, brethren, truly nothing could be more relevant to us in the 21st century, where we are told over and over again that our constitutional right as an American citizen is the freedom of speech, which we promptly use to justify being a carping, critical complainer. But as a believer indwelt by the Holy Spirit and recreated in the image of God in righteousness and truth, the absence of complaining and murmuring and arguing stands out as a way to prove ourselves. Paul says, verse 15, as blameless and innocent children of God, above reproach in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you appear as lights in the world. One of the ways in which we work out our salvation with fear and trembling is to stop murmuring, stop complaining. It separates us in incredible ways, unique ways from the world. All right, we parked long enough on that, but it segues into the text that I want to use here. You did not learn that from Jesus. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 17, Paul says, "So I tell you this and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do in the futility of their thinking. They are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, due to the hardening of their hearts. Having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality so as to indulge in every kind of impurity with a continual lust for more." Now, brethren, that has got to be one of the most descriptive, graphic descriptions outside of Romans chapter 1 of what happens to the human heart when God is rejected. Futility of thinking. In other words, they can't think straight. They're hopelessly confused. Anything that comes out of their mouth is foolish, darkened in their understanding, in which they come to the place in which they're calling good bad and bad good, up is down is up, light is dark, dark is light. They're excluded from the life of God. In other words, there's no spiritual life in them. Therefore, they're ignorant of spiritual truths and God's will, which leads to hardened hearts and callousness, in which there is no sense of shame. What used to be done in the dark is now done in the daytime. And that always leads itself to sexual perversion and every kind of impurity that knows no bounds. That pretty much describes our society, doesn't it? God forbid it should describe the church. But what the Apostle Paul is doing here is setting the stage to insist, by the Lord's authority, that the believers in Ephesus and in Fort Myers remind themselves, that we remind ourselves that we did not learn Christ in this way. To live like that does not come from Jesus. In other words, you used to live like the pagans, but now, having put on the new self, which is created in the image of God, you live a completely different lifestyle that looks nothing like this culture. What springs from your heart is His divine nature of righteousness and holy truth. Brethren, we need to be reminded of that constantly, because we are forgetful people, just like our ancestors, the Israelites, constantly forgetting. You know what? We need all the help we can get. And so when I thought about that, I thought of, well, that means we need a new wristband to remember things. So, work with me here. I created a companion acronym with WWJD. Are you ready for it? Are you sure, Daryl? Okay, here we go. YDLTFJ. Now, just say it with me. YDLTFJ. It just rolls off the tongue. Come on here, work with me. You don't think that'll catch on? YDLTFJ, YDLTFJ. What does it mean? It means you didn't learn that from Jesus. You didn't learn that from Jesus. Come on, brother. We live in a world of acronyms. We communicate with acronyms. You tell your BFF that you'll BRB unless they're going to BRT, LOL, and C and G. Anybody even know what C and G stands for? Chuckle and grin. I'm not making this up. I Googled it, all right? I got a text from my son-in-law a while back in which he wrote TYVM. I did not know what that meant. I had to call my daughter who's married to him, thank you very much. Thank you very much is what TYVM stands for. All right. Years ago, brethren, it was PUSH, P-U-S-H. Anybody remember what that stood for? Pray until something happens. Then it was FROG, F-R-O-G. Anybody remember what that was? Fully rely on God. Now, brethren, it's YDL-TFJ. That's funny. The first time I preached it, that's the same look I got from them. And in fact, in the back of the auditorium, when I did preach this, someone said, "John, order up some wristbands." I know they were joking, but I took it as a message from God. And I ordered up 250 of them. I got 25 left. If you'd like one, see me afterwards, but that's all that's left. They wanted a reminder. It's just and of course, Oliver, I think of odd for God, all right? Why not? Instead of OMG, OFG, odd for God. Wow, okay. But brethren, let me tell you something. I'm under no illusion that the answer to a life of godliness in a world of darkness is a wristband. What I know to be true is that we must maintain a consciousness, a constant awareness that our former manner of life, which is corrupted by lust and deception and driven by selfishness, has been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. In the life I live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself up for me. That I know. And I also know that the Holy Spirit wants to transform our minds with thoughts and attitudes that we have learned from Jesus, the way, the truth, and the life. The very week that I got these in the mail, passed them out to the congregation, Nancy and I began wearing the bracelet, the wristband, and we planned that week for a visit to my parents in Wilmington, Ohio, which was about an hour away. Now, we have developed over the years a rule in our home, and that is that you never leave the house with an appliance on. We've had a brother and sister whose house caught fire because the lint in their dryer, which they left on as they went away, caught fire. So our rule is you never leave any appliance on. So consequently, as I headed out the door, I reminded Nancy, "Honey, don't forget to turn off the dryer." A few minutes later, she hopped in the car and off we went. 5 minutes down into our journey, and she turned to me and she blurted out, "John, I forgot to turn off the dryer." The car came to a screeching halt. And I said, "What? How could you? I just reminded you before we left. Now we've got to go back to the house, and that means we're going to be late. Good grief, blah, 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 blah. Now, as Nancy recalls, I was speaking those last sentences with a louder than usual tone in my voice. I whipped the car around and headed back to the house to make sure that it hadn't burned to the ground. Of course, I confess that it's a way overreaction. Yes? Yes? The next day, as I got into the car to go to the church building where I think spiritual thoughts, deep spiritual thoughts of Jesus, holy thoughts. I put my key into the ignition and I turn the car on and I look up, and there, attached to my wiper blade, is Nancy's wristband that says, "You didn't learn that from Jesus." I turned off the car, got out, removed the wristband from the wiper blade, and with my heart in my hand, I went back into the house and I apologized, asking for forgiveness, because she was right. My behavior the day before was the old me that I did not learn from Jesus. When we demean, demoralize, and denigrate, you didn't learn that from Jesus. When we refuse to turn the other cheek, go the second mile, or love our enemies, you didn't learn that from Jesus. When our speech or our Facebook posts or our text reek of impatience and arrogance, say it with me, you didn't learn that from Jesus. As disciples of Christ, brethren, we're called to a higher standard of conduct, a conduct that we learn from Jesus. If indeed you have heard him and have been taught in him, just as truth is in Jesus. As disciples, we are to be yoked to Jesus so that we can hear him and be learning from him, so that when social media and television and the talking heads and the political pundits and the secular bloviators throw their truth at us, we will know that we didn't learn that from Jesus, and that we can take a stand against the unfruitful deeds of darkness and expose them with the light of the truth. Ephesians 5:11. The only hope for our world, brethren, is going to be the truth they see and they hear from us as we work out our salvation with fear and trembling and with love and gratitude. Because we're the salt of the earth, we're the light of the world, disciples holding forth the word of life in a crooked and depraved generation among whom we appear as lights. But maybe you think the world has gone too far, that it can't be reached. The context of this letter here in Ephesians chapter 4 should convince us otherwise. When Paul and his companions arrived in Ephesus, they came to a city that was steeped in the dark arts of demonic mysticism. It was a culture of immorality, impurity, and greed, a culture where Roman citizens worshiped Caesars as God. According to the historian Suetonius, Tiberius, the emperor who was in power when Jesus was crucified, that man was a sexual predator, a rapist, a pedophile, and a bisexual adulterer. Nero, the emperor reigning when most of the New Testament was being written, had an incestuous relationship with his mother, whom he later murdered. He was the first emperor to publicly marry another male, and he was complicit in his father's death and murdered his brothers and his wife. In spite of all of that, Philippians 4 verse 22 says that there were believers in Caesar's household. Brethren, engagement with the world is not pointless when Jesus is our message. The preaching of the gospel is still the power of God for salvation to those who believe, Romans 1:16. And when Paul and his band of brothers bore witness to the truth of Christ, it sent shockwaves through all of Asia. Read Acts chapter 19. Demetrius, the silversmith, protested against the gospel's effect because so many people, so many of the pagans were turning away from the great goddess Diana to such an extent that he feared that she would be dethroned from her magnificence. How many idols of the 21st century could be dethroned and stay dethroned if we would work out our salvation with fear and trembling and with love and gratitude for what we learned from Jesus. And so we sing to remind ourselves of those things we learn. Buried with Christ, my blessed Redeemer, dead to the old life of folly and sin. Satan may call, the world may entreat me. There is no voice that answers within. Dead unto sin, alive through the Spirit, risen with him from the gloom of the grave. All things are new, and I am rejoicing in his great love, his power to save. Dead to the world, the voices that call me, living anew, obedient but free. Dead to the joys that once did enthrall me. Yet 'tis not I, Christ liveth in me.